Welcome to What Grows. It's a podcast where we play with the connection between who we are and how we grow. I'm your host, Noella Moshi. So, Meg, you've helped people learn and grow from designing courses for Harvard and UCT, among others, to creating educational materials about racial equity in STEM. You're also a writer whose debut short story just won the Penn Robert J. Dow Short Story Prize. Congrats. And on top of that, you recently had a daughter. So we first became friends over a decade ago in Cape Town. And I think our bond really deepened during that trip to Spain. That was part spiritual adventure, part group bonding, and yeah, really impactful for me. And yeah, I've always been interested in people who live at the intersection of multiple callings. And you're navigating the worlds of learning design, creative writing, and new motherhood. And knowing you gracefully and thoughtfully. So I'm really happy we get to talk. Welcome.
Thanks so much, and thanks for such a lovely introduction.
So this is a question I ask everyone. Maybe it'll be easier for you as a writer, but if you could give your life a title, like it was a book, what would it be?
Oh, that's so funny because I'm so terrible at titling my short stories. It fills me with so much stress. But I don't know, something, well, for, because for my creative writing master's thesis, I did uh, like autofiction, so a collection of short stories, which was loosely based on, parts of my life from when I was about 5 all the way to maybe like 29 or so. And named that collection, I'm trying to think now. I titled it Bin Collection Day and Other Stressful Events. And so maybe I'll just steal that as that might be the title of my life.
Mm.
I was fascinated when I was young, and still am for some reason, by the collection of rubbish bins every week. I don't know why it excites me, but when I was young, I found it very stressful. It was like a very scary intrusion into like suburban life. And the other stressful events is basically, I think I'm someone that, yeah, gets quite stressed quite easily by life and transitions. But I suppose I've tried to embrace it and kind of muddle through it. So, yeah, it's not
Mm.
necessarily an entirely negative thing.
Mm. Okay, so many questions. First of all, how did you decide what to include in the short story collection? Like what stories did you choose to write about?
Yeah, it was quite a kind of muddled organic process where I wasn't sure whether I was going to do essays or short stories. And my thesis supervisor just said, like, just write wherever the energy is. And so, yeah, I kind of wrote a bunch of long, winding essays about, for example, one was all about my relationship with my mother from like childhood through to adulthood and the various phases. But I quickly realized that was quite an uninteresting essay, but there were parts of that where I could hone in on for like isolated short stories. And so, yeah, I let those sort of spots of energy dictate what I was going to include. So, for example, the one story was in high school and, like the Valentine's Day dance and how stressful that was, and coupled with like trying to join the debating team and being a terrible debater and getting a blank during some inter-school debating contest, or at university when I was quite involved in like more of a evangelical circle of people and was trying to reconcile that with a lot of questions I had around faith. So yeah, it sort of, yeah, I'd say like those sort of almost like dark spots on a heat map if you look at your life and want to see where the tension is and exploit that in some way.
Mm. What, when I think about all of those events, are there commonalities across them in terms of the types of things that stress you out? And has that changed?
I would say the question of who I am in the world and my environment, and that's like from a very personal perspective to like a political perspective. Um, so I think that's the main overriding question, and at least I fictionalize that so it's easier to sort of get that distance when you're exploring some of those questions through fiction. And it's hard. I would say it probably hasn't changed. It's just hard to know yet, um, because I think I've made quite a pointed decision, or it was just not even a decision, but because I couldn't write about something I was immediately going through, I had to have the distance of a couple of years. So maybe the the last story was, maybe like 5 years previous to who I was then writing it. So it's hard to know actually. I don't, yeah, if I'm being humble, I'd say I haven't quite figured out, or it's maybe a question you become more comfortable with knowing, like, or working through, like, who are you and what is your role in the world? And
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, knowing that it sets a direction and a strategy for life that would be really helpful. Like if I know what my role is, then I can make decisions about important things. I am curious about the story about your relationship with your mother, and whatever you feel comfortable sharing about that relationship, and what parts of it, if any, are you noticing replaying themselves in your relationship with your daughter?
yeah, it's a very topical question. Um, I suppose I could answer that question through maybe the first short story in this collection is written from like this fictional character at the age of 5, and the type of reverence she has for her mother, and her mother as being very self-sacrificing, holy, perfect type of person. Um, and I obviously now at 36 know that my mom isn't perfect and she's flawed like most of us, but she's near to what I would think of as a perfect person. And that's been, and I mean that in positive and negative ways, I suppose. She holds herself to very high standards, and she would also be able to, I think, admit that herself. Um, and has, yeah, I think, worked through, um, worked through being okay disappointing people, being okay disappointing her children, for example, or other people in her life. Um, but I think now as a mother, I've set myself a very high bar because I think that it's it's maybe a disservice to my child to show the ambivalence of motherhood, the fact that it's not all rapture and love and good moods, and it's when I'm speaking about it, I can know that my mom in my childhood definitely had her days when she was in a bad mood or made mistakes, but the veneer of that is not as strong as just this idea that my mom like never made mistakes, or in the sort of a religious context, like never sinned. The story that I wrote was all about like thinking about that's what a saint is, someone who, never makes mistakes and never sins and is always in a good mood. And um, and I suppose I would like to show my daughter more of a variety of moods and imperfections, but I think it's going to be something I really need to be intentional about. And it's not something that's going to come easily. And I notice it now when I'm interacting with her. She's only 4 months, but if I'm, late at night rocking her to sleep and frustrated that she's not sleeping, or, in the early days, which is just crying and crying or, whatever it was, felt like I was on end. It was really hard for me to express my frustration. But I think that is also a necessary thing of being a parent and trying to be honest with yourself and with your children.
Mm, yeah. Wow. Okay. We have very different kind of mother experiences of our mother, but I can very much relate to the new mom. Just like, oh, the struggle is real. In 4 months, that's oh my goodness, a newborn. it's
Yeah.
it's so hard. I had to kind of really like just like claw my way back to a world outside of that kind of urgency and immediacy of taking care of the child. It's just hormonally, but also just factually, it just takes time to realize I can take a breath,
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. You talked about the ambivalence of motherhood or you mentioned that phrase, and I don't know if we're thinking of the same thing, but I will say that I've had a conversation with a friend who was considering whether, her and her partner wanted to get pregnant, and I said, yeah, I don't like that women talk about motherhood as if it's like really perfect and really easy and for everyone. And it really just doesn't have to be the case that people have these wonderful experiences just because they've committed to something. And I wonder what to communicate to our daughters and when to help them. It's not even about making more informed decisions, but to just like humanize their expectations and their understanding of the journey.
Yeah. That sounds great, but I think it's exactly the thing that I wouldn't know how besides trying to be honest with her as I go, whether that's about how motherhood has its losses and wonderful moments or anything in life, I suppose. And the one thing that I notice, because I journal a lot, is when I'm journaling about how hard I found the last 4 months, I'm always I'm always conscious that she might read this one day. It's
Mm.
such a strange experience. I think the first time I journaled about it, I almost addressed her to try and give myself permission to be as honest as possible in these pages. To say like, her name's Anouk, so like, Anouk, if you're reading this, I hope you know that XYZ. I can't remember what I said. Um, so there's a lot of performativity that goes into my journaling these days, which I'm trying to constantly correct. Um, I don't know, I've gone on a tangent in terms of like the
Mm.
question you asked, but it seems to relate in some way. Or maybe there's a hope that I can be comfortable enough sharing my journals with her because I've been honest and I'm okay with that honesty or something.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I don't know. There's a lot there that's interesting. One of the things is I keep thinking about authority with vulnerability or vulnerability with authority. Like if you and I know I think about this in a work setting more than in parenthood, but I wonder how it applies to that, which is just if, for example, you have a team and you tell them something concerning, like we have 6 months cash runway in the bank, so we gotta raise money right now. That's vulnerability. But if you don't give them some way to be able to like support in raising the money or show them that there's actions they can take, so no authority, then that vulnerability could crush them. Similarly, if you give a team authority, you say, go do all of these other things, but there is no consequences for actions, there's no vulnerability, that team doesn't make good decisions either.
Mm,
And so it's just, yeah, I kind of, that interplay with with people, certainly with children, like what do we choose to share with the people we're letting into our lives in terms of vulnerability, and then what do we choose to manage, where do we say no, you cannot pass further than this because this is my space. I mean, the line is nowhere more blurred than with a child, I imagine.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's something I think it probably will get more and more complicated as my daughter grows. I don't know if how old is your daughter now?
Who? Yeah, she's already asking
Wow.
questions. It's it's a whole thing.
Wow. It really makes me nervous, like the questions. And just feeling like you're able to give you know, answers that feel informed. And, if I think about, especially when I think about spirituality and raising my children in the spiritual tradition, sometimes I'm like, oh, I really got to brush up on whatever it is, theology or the Bible or something, because my parents just, they always had such, like, um, well crafted answers, but also, that kind of the vulnerable verse, authoritative. They were always very vulnerable with how they answered questions of faith, and but they're always very knowledgeable as well. So yeah, it makes me
Hmm.
nervous.
Yeah. Well, okay. There's always like three questions I want to ask you, but first one is like, tell me about your spiritual journey since we last kind of lived in the same space. I mean, we were both kind of committed to Catholicism at that point. I have since like not gone back to the Catholic Church for at least the past 10, 15 years, just but I have kind of wanted to maintain a relationship with God and have some understanding of powers beyond myself. I think that's very important. And as I started my family, community became also kind of really important, and I'm still trying to navigate that. But I want to hear about your journey. Yeah. What's it been like?
Yeah. So we were at World Youth Day in 2011, and in some ways, my journey has changed, and in other ways, it's remained the same in good and bad ways. I would say that I still identify as being a Catholic, but that comes with a lot of grappling and explanations and tension and all of those things. Um, I'd say the closest to a community I have at the moment is a spiritual reading group where um, I would probably be, if anything, the most mainstream Catholic, which is saying something because I wouldn't say I'm a mainstream Catholic. Um, but there's other people in the group, they've identified more with the women. I'm going to get the term wrong. The woman priest movement, which is um, wow, not to go into a complete tangent, but a part of the church that identifies Catholic, but see but have ordained women as priests, which means that they have been, yeah, I'm trying to think of a softer word than excommunicated. So it's complicated. It's like identifying as Catholic, but according to the official church would not be Catholic. Um, and that's been an interesting movement to become familiar with. Um, and actually, one of the women priests, she jointly married me and my husband with a Methodist minister. So it was like a ecumenical kind of ceremony. Um, and in some ways, I think I've remained part of the Catholic Church because it's so part of like a home and a familiarity, which again comes with like an inheritance from my parents and feeling in some ways loyal to my parents, but not in a necessarily negative way. But it's raised a lot of questions in terms of what tradition will raise our daughter in. My husband identifies as Christian, but he doesn't belong to a particular denomination. And um, I'm not sure if I would want to make my child like jump through all the hoops of catechism and first Holy Communion if yeah, but in some what I'm yeah, I think what I'm grappling with is I've seen the value in some way of growing up in an institutionalized faith because it's given me that container, um, and then I've been able to manipulate it or work with it or experiment with it in my adulthood. The reading group I'm part of, we're like big Richard Rohr fans, and for people who don't know, Richard Rohr is like a Benedictine. No, is he Benedictine? No, Franciscan. Oh, I'm gonna get this wrong. He's a
I
he's
think it's Franciscan. Yeah.
Franciscan, but very, talks about the first and the second half of life and the first half of being institutionalized religion and your identity and asking who you are in the second half of life. Um, Throwing all of those pieces of identity on their head, or living with the both and the gray. And so yeah, there's a part of me that almost does appreciate the idea of an institutionalized religion that you can then play with. But I'm definitely not tied to that idea, and it's hard to know how to live in that as adults. My husband and I keep thinking, oh, we need to find a church that has like a strong family setup and there's things for the kids, and that's something that like we've thought about, but um, that's just one part of the puzzle. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if my daughter asked me about remaining a Catholic or about certain things that Catholics believe in that maybe I don't identify with as much. I don't have much of a watertight argument, and I also got to be okay with the fact that I don't have all the answers. But um, it's hard to imagine that, and especially if like there is a sense of an institutional religion that I want to give her in her first half of life.
Yeah. When I think about that Richard Rohr, yeah, his work and how important he talks about how important it is to have the rules and the boundaries in the first half of life so that you can decide what you want to keep for that second half. The pressure that I'm seeing on parents is to have answers and to have boundaries. And is it always terrible to live out loud that tension with the child? What does it do to them to see their parent grappling with something or saying, I don't have an answer? It's something I might never be able to answer, but I'm sitting with this uncertainty. Yeah, I can imagine it as empowering. I can also imagine it as scary. But when you talk about your mother and her just like just I don't know, you mentioned the word perfect, but I imagine someone who has answers and has good answers. Is that what this generation needs?
Yeah, I mean, it's a much more forgiving and whole and realistic way to live. Yeah, and it obviously reflects on maybe my ideas of what parents are or should be. And I think if I think about conversations when I was young and thinking about, asking about big things like heaven and hell, and especially like the Catholic in the Catholic universe, purgatory, which was like this crazy idea. Um, my mom always, I appreciated that she always framed it as, we don't know for sure. No one knows for sure. Catholics believe in purgatory because it's a helpful way of thinking through the gray. It's not like you saved versus not saved. At least I think that's how she saw it. But we don't know, and no one has the answers. And I think that's true for a number of those things that are not absolutes. Um, and yeah, I did respect her for that. It just feels like she had a lot more answers than I would have. and maybe that's okay as well.
Mm, mm. I mean, it's also, I mean, is it? I don't know if we're over, I'm saying this because I live in this era, but it also feels like there's a lot more uncertainty lately.
Yeah, yeah,
One of the big things, obviously, that everyone, and I'm sure in your learning design space as well, but also in the creative writing space, one of the big things people are talking about is AI. Has that inter has that intersected with your life in any of those spaces or even in parenthood?
yeah. Definitely in the workspace. It's something that's very present on my mind. Um, it's yeah, I always get quite um frightened about this idea that there's that like got the hype curve, I think it's called, where they've got like the early adopters, and then right at the end they've got what they call the laggards. And I'm always so scared of being this laggard and thinking I'm gonna be an early adopter, even though I think that ship has sailed. Okay, I'll start that with that ship has sailed. But it is something I'm needing to think about in terms of my job, um, and choosing a job that is helping me to work with AI in a way that's almost keeping up with its advances. It feels like quite a big question, but one I'm not frightened about. And maybe that's a bit naive. I think when I was going through a lot of like um, work discernment a few years ago, like thinking about big questions of like, what is my purpose? Um, I became quite clear-eyed that being a learning designer is more like a utilitarian purpose. Like it pays the bills and it's interesting to an extent. But writing is my number one purpose, and I will try and craft my life and priorities around that. Um, and that's a life purpose. It's not something that um, I'll be able to figure out by the end of my life either. Like it's they always say like your purpose needs to be bigger than you or your life. And I suppose I feel so convicted by that even if AI is reshaping writing, the purpose will somehow survive or become meaningful, even if it's in a different form or a form that I need to adapt to.
That's really encouraging. That I really needed to hear that, honestly. But something I've also noticed, first of all, I love that purpose is bigger than our lives. I actually had never heard that before, but I'm also not worried about writing because I enjoy doing it so much that even if someone, in fact, so many thousands of people can write better than I can already, and that's not going to stop me from writing. If AI could do my book that it takes me a year to do in 5 minutes, I'm still going to do my book. And that's
I love
purpose.
that.
Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know exactly what the future holds, but I can say that for now, the times that I've used AI to shortcut some of my program, so I do program design and like strategic planning, and the times when I've used AI without actually sitting down and first writing something up and then asking it to critique my work. If I say do this from scratch, I'm so not like physically invested in the results. I don't even understand fully what this process is like because program design is followed by implementation, right? And it's like I'm not bought into this output in a way that allows me to implement, at a high level. And so and then sometimes even when I look at things that I've had to write for work and I used AI, I'm like, I actually could have written this better if I just trusted my process, because some people use AI as a shortcut. I used to use it because I assumed it wrote better than I did in a work context. But now the skill, and now I mean, we talk about diamonds in a mine versus a lab, like having outputs that sound unique is potentially like a value add. That's the sought after commodity, I guess.
yeah, and maybe there's, well, I don't know, I suppose there's positives and negatives to um going for that slant on things. Um, but yeah, I do resonate with what you're saying in terms of the shortcut or the amount of effort and time. I can feel myself getting lazy in the same way that I really miss not being able to read like a map book, like a physical map book anymore, or not having more of an innate sense of direction. As much as I don't need to use my brain power for that, like I miss those capabilities, and it feels like that's happening so fast with AI. Um, and so, yeah, to your point of writing, there is something. It feels almost old school now to write something from scratch, and um, in terms of like the creative writing process, there is something still sort of kind of pure and beautiful about that. But when it comes actually to my work, then I'm all about AI. So I suppose it just shows where my priorities and investment lie.
Yeah, I think so too. Like, what do I need a shortcut for versus the process being the product in these other spaces. Oh, I mean, yeah, I don't know. And I also really like what you said about you wrestled with what you were doing and you became clear-eyed about writing being your purpose and then learning design being kind of what pays the bills. How did you how did you get to that? And how did you even get to the point where you felt you needed to wrestle with it?
Mm, I think that a long way of answering this, but I would say for most of my 20s, I was really struggling with writer's block and just making time for writing. And it was only when I decided to do a master's, because that was like a structured way of like dedicating time to writing, that I started to become more confident in that love or purpose. Um, and I was doing that alongside my learning design job. Um, but it eventually became untenable in terms of finishing off my thesis. And so through a long process of discernment, which merged with moving in with my now husband, and that was a whole other set of factors when you become dependent on someone for a portion of your life. So basically deciding to quit my job and finish off my master's for about 6 months. Um, and I think where it became clear to me was in that period during or after the thesis when I was thinking, well, what next? Do I, I think I was very pragmatic or quite realistic about the idea that there's no way I'm going to be a writer for income. And there's some, maybe if if life worked out really well, that might be a possibility, but it feels like quite a remote possibility. Um, and so therefore thinking, well, how am I going to arrange my life around something that makes me feel most alive? Um, and I'd say, I think it's chapter 2 or 3 of, I've always wanted to finish this book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, but I've only ever got to chapter 2. Or whichever chapter it is on, I think it's writing your personal manifesto. And that's what really clarified it for me, um, where it really asks you to state your, I think it's your values, and you make that into a manifesto, and it talks about the ladder that you need to put up. Don't climb the ladder that's up on the wrong wall. Making sure that
Mhm.
you're not climbing the wrong ladder. And you look down one day and you're like, I've been climbing the wrong ladder for like years and years. Like that really petrified me. And so I think once I'd written that manifesto and realized, and it was a concrete decision point because I had a job that I was thinking about taking that was like a promotion, and I knew that it was it would take away from my writing, the time and the energy I'd have to give to it. And then that brings in like the true versus false self that Thomas Merton, or I think Buddhists also have like a version of that. Like my false self would think about, oh, I'm gonna, you know, get ahead in my career or earn more money, or it's gonna be more stable. Versus I would rather keep doing what I'm doing, and have this writing thing on the side. Um, So yeah, I was actually thinking about trying to bring up that personal manifesto now when I'm again at a bit of a decision point. And as much as I need to think about the survival of my job, I also need to think about my writing. And I haven't come to terms with if there's a mix there that works.
And then you throw in motherhood as well, and finding time to write while being a new mom is ooh, that's a whole other thing.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
So yeah, the true self and the false self and the discernment piece. Has that ever changed? Like, are there seasons where you're like, you know what, I need to earn more money, I can ramp down my writing, or, you know, I don't know. Do the priorities stay constant for you?
That is like such a good question because it rubs up against like idealism versus reality. And I think I'm gifted at the moment that I'm in a relationship that is making it possible for me to not need to earn more money for the sake of being financially secure, um, because my husband's doing some of that. But it might change. His company's been affected by like the US aid cuts, and
Mm.
it definitely brings a dose of realism to the table, in terms of his space. And as you mentioned, the uncertainty, it is a very uncertain time and world. And if his job becomes financially unstable, or if he becomes less enthused by his job and his calling, and he needs to take time to figure out his priorities and alignment, then it might be that I need to take a turn in earning more money for us. We haven't yet had to like you know come come up against that, but there's still a long life ahead. And I think also with the season of motherhood and seasons of different times of motherhood, I think I'm also trying to reconcile the fact that there's going to be more fertile seasons for writing and less fertile seasons, and that's where I keep thinking at least it's a lifelong purpose and there's time. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I feel that definitely. Very, very relatable. And when I think for the first 6 months after my daughter was born, I mean, I tried to journal every morning, and maybe I did twice or something. It was just, I was deep in it. Um, so when you are able to write these days and are able to journal, what do you find yourself journaling about?
It's mostly all of the mundane complaints. Um, I think journaling has been a space of being as mundane as possible. There's no like art to it. There's no illusion of any good writing. It's like my safe space to, just often just complain. And I think it was such a, a sense of support. I think especially in those, they call those first 40 days of motherhood. Although for me, it's lasted much longer, that sense of, just confusion. But my parents were here for the first 3 weeks of my daughter being born. So there was a bit of respite in terms of having some moments to journal, and I'm a bit too scared to read those. It's too soon and too fresh, but it's just a lot of stream of consciousness of, you know, what how I slept or what's panicking me, what the weather's like, how the weather's affecting my mood. Um, yeah, it's funny. I journaled this morning and I can't even think about what I journaled about. I think I said today is Monday. Um, yesterday was Sunday. I'm not sure. It's as yeah, mundane as that, but somehow it helps. Um, yeah.
Even the just the decision that I'm taking time for myself to do something that matters to me, even if you're not able to get much down or something that you think is like a huge treasure. Like I think that really helps me when I remind myself to prioritize myself, you
Mm.
know.
And I suppose the ability, I think also I've been so lucky with, like we have a nanny, and that has allowed me to have a little bit of time to journal if it's the weekend and I know I'm not going to journal because there are other priorities while Anouk is sleeping. I know, okay, well, when Monday comes, there's going to be a little bit of a respite. Um, and yeah, that is a privilege, in many ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So to kind of wrap up, we can't stop without talking about this short story, Little Women, that explores the dynamics between two sisters in a religious family in South Africa after one gets engaged. I read it, loved it, and I
Oh,
listened to the podcast episode that you did as well, talking about it. That was awesome. Um, and I mean, yeah, the original Little Women by Louisa May Alcott it's a classic about sisterhood and societal expectations. What drew you to reimagine that? And like what elements of that were you looking to kind of explore in your South African context? Yeah. So I'm curious what drew you to Little Women and to specifically reimagining that within your context.
yeah. Yeah, it was definitely a retroactive decision to name the story Little Woman. And so in some ways it feels more anecdotal, accidental that the story is called Little Woman and there's maybe such a direct comparison between its um, you know, I want to say like alma mater or the the book, the famous book. But yeah, my it was a supervisor who suggested that I call the story Little Woman. Again, based on previously, I'm terrible at naming stories. Um, but I think it comes back to my mother. Little Woman was her favorite book, and she would talk about the characters and their differences, and as you said, like infusing these complex themes of family and competitiveness and loyalty and identity, and I think especially breaking free of your family mold to find out who you are in the world. Um, and so, in many ways, I suppose there is a comparison between the book and my short story, even though they're completely different. And I don't want to make it seem at all like there's any. Uh, yeah, the book stands on its own.
Cute. Yeah, that was good. And about titles, I'm terrible at, at titles too. What makes for a good title, and what makes it so hard to achieve that?
I think the title, in a way, I think a good title almost is a portal into the subtext of a story. So that's maybe why it's so difficult, because you're trying to find a title that's naming the story in this very kind of subterranean way. And obviously, the subtext is not something that is obvious, or easy to pin down often, and then you're trying to find a title that does that for you. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
quite a scary thing.
And I would think, especially with autofiction, which I've been writing some kind of autofiction short stories lately, and then you have to not only be able to kind of explain what happened and why it's important in these ways, but understand the underlying kind of, I don't know, it requires such intense self-examination to understand the subtext of a of an autofiction story, at least for me. I can understand surface level what happened, how it made me feel, and how to make it an interesting narrative. But the stuff that I'm not self aware of, I think is the stuff that the title should be about. and and I'm not self aware of it
Interesting.
still, you know?
Yeah, it's like a hall of mirrors or something.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're focusing on your writing. You're also, working on learning design and also raising your daughter with your husband. What do you kind of when you think about the next 10 years, like what do you imagine your life to look like if you were to dream as big as possible?
Wow. I think it would be that I had succeeded enough in my writing to be making some kind of money from related activities. So, that might be lecturing or editing things. It's all very vague. But that would be, I think, the goal. Yeah, and be able to, yeah, so without thinking about any um, boundaries, it would be somehow having, maybe balance is a wrong word, but like a soup of having a bit of time for my personal writing and having a bit of time for activities that make money that I really am passionate about. Shame, I feel like I'm bash learning design a bit in this call, but it is what it is. Um, and then having a bit of time to be present for my daughter slash children. And that's also something that is a whole nother topic for another day, figuring out what that looks like. So yeah, and I like that question because I really did discern this question of having children, and that was one of the questions that a book that I read asked me. Imagine your life in 10 years' time, and then I think in 20 years' time, and what do you see? And there is I hope that there's a fullness and you know, chaos and busyness and competing priorities, but life and stimulation, hopefully, and good conversations or activities. Um, yeah, like mess, but in in a good sense.
Mm, thank you. You have given me so much to think about, especially around true self versus false self and what is it that I'm really called to do and what is my bigger purpose. I love speaking with you. I always do. So thank you so much for your time, Meg.
Well, thank you for the excellent questions.
If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm also always looking for guests who enjoy meaningful conversations. If that sounds like you, please send me a message and let me know what you'd like to talk about. I'll get back to you. Thanks for listening.